In October 1962, the entire night shift of Aerolux Dynamics, 153 men and women, vanished from inside a sealed factory in the Nevada desert. 40 years later, a demolition crew preparing the site for redevelopment would break through a concrete floor, revealing a truth far more terrifying than a simple disappearance. Where are you reading us from? Share your city and country in the comments before we continue this story. The company town of Finchville was a gleaming mirage of post-war optimism engineered by its visionary founder, Alistair Finch. It was a self-contained utopia carved from the arid landscape, promising prosperity and a shared sense of purpose at the height of the Cold War. The town existed for a single reason: to serve the advanced aerospace factory that was its heart, a monument to American ingenuity and ambition that hummed with activity day and night. Alistair Finch was more than an employer. He was a patriarch, a celebrated pioneer of industry who had built a community from dust. He provided his workers with modern homes, schools for their children, and a belief that they were not merely assembling aircraft parts. They were, in his words, building the very framework of tomorrow. His employees revered him, placing their complete trust in his leadership and the grand future he promised them. The workers at Aerolux Dynamics were a hand-picked collective of the nation's brightest engineers, skilled mechanics, and dedicated technicians. They were the lifeblood of Finchville, a tight-knit community bound by their shared work and isolated location. They saw themselves as pioneers on the cutting edge of technology, proud to contribute to projects that were shrouded in national importance. Among them was the respected chief engineer, Elias Corbin, a man known for his meticulous nature and unwavering loyalty to Finch's vision. On the evening of October the 12th, the 153 members of the night shift clocked in as usual, the familiar scent of machine oil and hot metal filling the air. The vast assembly hall buzzed with controlled energy, the sounds of rivets and welders echoing against the high steel ceiling. It was a night like any other, defined by the steady rhythm of production and the quiet camaraderie of men and women working toward a common goal under the desert stars. As per standard procedure for classified project runs, the facility's massive reinforced steel doors were locked from the inside at precisely 10:00 p.m. This was a common occurrence at Aerolux, a security measure designed to protect the sensitive government-contracted work being done within. No one questioned the protocol. It was part of the job, a symbol of the trust placed in them and the importance of their contribution to the nation's technological supremacy. Inside the sealed facility, the work continued under the bright fluorescent lights. Blueprints were consulted, engine casings were carefully machined, and complex wiring harnesses were assembled with precision. Elias Corbin made his final rounds, checking progress and exchanging brief words with his teams. The atmosphere was one of focused diligence, the collective hum of machinery, a comforting and constant presence. There was no indication that this night would be any different from the hundreds that had preceded it. When the morning shift arrived just before dawn, they were greeted not by the familiar sounds of industry, but by an unnerving and profound silence. The sprawling parking lot held the cars of the night shift workers, coated in a fine layer of morning dew, but the factory itself was still. The usual transition period, a noisy and bustling exchange between shifts, was entirely absent, replaced by a stillness that felt deeply unnatural and wrong. The shift supervisor used his master key to unlock the main personnel door, a sense of unease growing with every step. Inside, the factory was pristine, almost sterile, but utterly empty. A half-full coffee cup sat on a desk in the break room, still warm to the touch. A wrench lay on the floor next to an unfinished engine casing, as if dropped only a moment before. It was a scene frozen in time, missing only its actors. A frantic search of the massive complex revealed the same eerie tableau everywhere. Personal effects remained untouched in lockers, jackets hung on hooks, and lunchboxes sat on benches, waiting to be claimed. The entire workforce of 153 people had vanished without a trace from within a securely locked building. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, and no indication that anyone had entered or left the facility after the doors were sealed. The initial investigation, led by the local sheriff's department and quickly escalated to federal agents, was extensive but ultimately fruitless. Investigators were baffled by the physical impossibility of the situation. The factory was a fortress, a sealed environment with no hidden exits, and a state-of-the-art security system that registered no breaches. The very structure of the building seemed to mock their efforts, standing as a silent testament to an inexplicable event. Every possible theory was explored and systematically dismissed. There was no ransom note to suggest a mass kidnapping. No political group came forward to claim responsibility. The idea of a coordinated, voluntary walkout was discarded as illogical. No one would leave behind their cars, wallets, and personal belongings. The investigation hit a wall of solid steel and unanswered questions, leaving law enforcement grasping at impossible explanations. The official inquiry stalled, suffocated by a complete lack of evidence. With no bodies, no witnesses, and no motive, the case grew cold with astonishing speed. The final report concluded with a simple, unsatisfying, open verdict, a bureaucratic admission of defeat. The disappearance of 153 American citizens from inside a locked room became one of the nation's most chilling and intractable unsolved mysteries, a wound with no prospect of healing. For the families of the vanished, the open verdict was a torment. They were left suspended in a void of unending grief, unable to mourn and unable to move on. They were given no answers, only a collection of bizarre theories that ranged from secret military experiments to extraterrestrial abduction. Their loved ones were gone, and the world they had built in Finchville began to crumble around them, consumed by the lingering silence. The town of Finchville, once a beacon of progress, slowly withered. Without its workforce, the factory fell silent permanently, its machinery gathering dust. Families moved away, unable to bear the daily reminder of their loss. The neat rows of houses became empty shells, and the once vibrant community became a ghost town, a haunting monument to the inexplicable tragedy that had stolen its soul and its future. Over the years, the story of the vanished 153 solidified into a dark piece of American folklore. It became a campfire story, a subject for sensationalist books and conspiracy theorists, each new telling adding another layer of myth to the original stark reality of the loss. The human element, the individual lives of the 153 people, was gradually eroded, replaced by the grand, unsolvable puzzle they had left behind. Hallister Finch, publicly devastated by the loss of his family, eventually closed the plant for good and moved on, his reputation as a tragic but brilliant industrialist untarnished. He funded philanthropic causes and passed away decades later, celebrated as a titan of his era. His connection to the strange event at his Nevada factory was seen as a sad footnote in an otherwise stellar career, a mystery he took to his grave. The factory itself stood as a silent sentinel in the desert, its windows boarded up, its fences rusted. It was a place locals avoided, a landmark of sorrow that loomed over the valley. For 40 years it held its secrets within its sealed walls, the truth of that October night locked away. The world had accepted the mystery as unsolvable, a strange anomaly in an otherwise rational world. The children of the vanished grew up in the shadow of their parents' disappearance, their lives defined by a question they could never answer. Generations were shaped by the event, inheriting a legacy of uncertainty and loss. They were forced to live with the official narrative, or lack thereof, a story that made no sense but was the only one they had. The truth they were told was likely lost forever. But the physical evidence of that night was not gone. It was merely hidden. The pristine factory, the abandoned cars, and the personal effects were all part of a carefully constructed stage. The disappearance was not a random event or a paranormal occurrence. It was a meticulously planned and executed act designed to appear inexplicable. The real question was not how they vanished, but why they were made to. The official story, one of a mysterious event that defied explanation, served a specific purpose. It created a myth that was so fantastic, so unbelievable, that it discouraged any serious, prolonged investigation into more rational and therefore more horrifying possibilities. The narrative of an unsolvable puzzle was the perfect cover for a calculated crime, diverting attention away from the logical and toward the fantastical. For 4 decades, that narrative held firm. The mystery was a closed book, a cold case so frigid it was considered permanently frozen. The families were left with only memories and speculation, while the world moved on, content to file the event under unexplained phenomena. The silence from the desert was absolute, and it seemed destined to last for eternity. But time does not erase all truths. Sometimes it merely buries them, waiting for an unwitting hand to begin digging. The concrete floor of the main assembly hall, poured and cured long ago, held a secret that was never meant to be found, a key to unlocking the entire 40-year-old mystery. The silence was about to be broken by the jarring sound of a jackhammer. The story of the vanished 153 became a dark piece of American folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in the desert winds. The truth, however, was not lost to the supernatural or the stars. It was buried, intentionally and methodically, beneath layers of concrete and decades of silence. But who had the power to orchestrate such a disappearance, and more importantly, why? In the stark sunlight of 2002, 40 years after the silence fell, the Aerolux Dynamics factory was little more than a rusting skeleton. The desert had begun to reclaim it, wind whistling through shattered panes of glass and sand piling up against its sealed steel doors. Finchville was a ghost town, its neat suburban houses now hollowed-out monuments to a vanished community. The site was slated for demolition, a final erasure of a place defined by an inexplicable tragedy. The past, it seemed, was about to be turned into dust and hauled away. A demolition crew contracted by a land development corporation moved across the site with practiced indifference. To them, the factory was just another job, a mountain of concrete and steel to be broken down. They were men accustomed to the noise of destruction, their days measured in tons of rubble. The legends of the vanished 153 were just local folklore, ghost stories told over cheap beer, but not something that concerned them. Their focus was on the structural blueprints and the methodical dismantling of the main assembly hall, the very heart of the old factory. The work was loud and monotonous until one blistering afternoon. A worker operating a heavy-duty jackhammer on the vast concrete floor of the assembly hall felt a sudden jarring change. The familiar, brittle shattering of aging concrete was replaced by a deep, resonant thud, a sound that spoke of something far more substantial beneath the surface. He stopped, the abrupt silence drawing the attention of his foreman. The floor in this section wasn't behaving as the 40-year-old schematics suggested it should. It was thicker, reinforced with something that wasn't on the original plans. Curiosity piqued. The crew focused their efforts on the anomalous section. After hours of careful, heavy work, they broke through the top layer, revealing not earth or a simple foundation, but the corner of a second, deeper structure. It was a slab of reinforced, lead-lined concrete, meticulously sealed and utterly out of place. This was no utility tunnel or forgotten basement. The construction was deliberate, almost like a vault, and its existence was a complete secret. The foreman, a man who had seen almost everything on demolition sites, knew this was beyond his pay grade and immediately called the authorities. The call from the local sheriff's office was patched through to the Nevada State Police Cold Case Unit in Carson City. It landed on the desk of Detective Miles Corbin, a man for whom the name Aerolux Dynamics was not a piece of trivia, but the defining story of his life. His grandfather, Elias Corbin, had been the chief engineer on that final shift. Miles had grown up in the long shadow of that mystery, his career choice a direct consequence of a question that had haunted his family for 2 generations. The case was his birthright. When the dispatcher mentioned a structural anomaly found beneath the factory floor, a cold, electric feeling shot through Miles. He had spent years poring over the original case files, memorizing every dead end and every dismissed theory. He knew the factory's blueprints by heart, and there was no record of any subterranean structure in the main assembly hall. Without a moment's hesitation, he told them he was on his way. This was the first new piece of information on the case in 4 decades, and he would be the one to see it firsthand. The drive to Finchville was a pilgrimage through his own family's history. He passed the derelict signs for the town his grandfather helped build, the abandoned gas stations, and the sun-bleached skeletons of family homes. The silence of the place felt heavier than ever, charged with a new and terrifying potential. For 40 years, the official narrative was one of an impossible, almost supernatural event, but a hidden concrete structure suggested something far more grounded, something meticulously planned and brutally human. The mystery was not a myth, it was a construction. Arriving at the site, Miles Corbin took command with a quiet, intense authority that left no room for argument. The demolition crew, now silent and unnerved, stood back as police cordoned off the area. Miles knelt at the edge of the breach, looking down at the exposed corner of the hidden chamber. The quality of the workmanship was exceptional, designed for containment and permanence. It was immediately clear that this was not a later addition, but part of the original construction, deliberately omitted from the official records. It was built to be secret. The process of opening the chamber was slow and deliberate. Forensic engineers were called in, confirming the structure was hermetically sealed. There were no doors, no obvious points of entry. It had been designed to be a permanent, inaccessible space. Using specialized cutting equipment, they spent the better part of a day carefully carving an opening large enough for a person to enter. As the final section of concrete and steel was lifted away, a gust of stale, perfectly preserved air washed over them, the captured atmosphere of 1962. Miles was the first to descend into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through the void. The space was not a tomb filled with human remains, as some had nervously speculated. It was a room, approximately 20 by 20 feet, and it was clinical and stark. The walls were lined with thick sound-dampening panels, and heavy-duty electrical conduits ran in neat, insulated lines across the ceiling. It was an observation post, a control room built in the heart of the factory floor, yet completely isolated from it. The discovery fundamentally and irrevocably shattered the 40-year-old narrative. A mass disappearance from a sealed building had always pointed toward the inexplicable, but a secret soundproofed control room pointed directly to a planned event. Someone had built this chamber to watch, to listen, to control the circumstances of that night. The 153 workers had not simply vanished. They were subjected to something that required observation from a protected, hidden vantage point. The case was no longer a mystery. It was an active crime scene. The room was Spartan, containing only a few pieces of equipment. There were several monitoring stations with blank screens and disconnected wiring, a simple steel chair and a ventilation system that had long since ceased to function. It was a place designed for a single purpose, for a single observer to witness an event on the factory floor above. The cold, calculated nature of the room sent a chill through even the most seasoned officers at the scene. This was premeditation on an industrial scale, a level of planning that was deeply unsettling. In the precise center of the room, sitting on a heavy steel pedestal, was the chamber's primary and most significant artifact. It was a massive, industrial-grade Ampex reel-to-reel tape recorder, a state-of-the-art machine for its time. It was perfectly preserved in the dry, sealed environment, its metallic casing gleaming under the investigators' lights. A thick reel of magnetic tape was still threaded through its mechanism, the take-up spool partially filled. It was frozen in time, poised as if it had just finished recording. This was the trophy proof Miles had only ever dreamed of finding. It was a physical object, a potential witness that could speak across 4 decades of silence. The existence of the chamber proved the disappearance was an orchestrated event. The presence of a high-end recording device suggested that the event, whatever it was, had been documented. The truth of what happened to his grandfather and 152 other people was not lost to the ether. It was very likely spooled onto that fragile strip of magnetic tape. The implications were staggering. The official investigation in 1962 had been a failure because it operated on the assumption of a mystery. They were looking for a cause, an external force, or a rational explanation for an irrational event. They never knew they should have been looking for a crime scene hidden in plain sight, a conspiracy executed by someone with the power to alter the very blueprints of the factory and build a secret witness box into its foundation. Miles felt a surge of grim vindication. His entire life had been a response to the open verdict that had declared his grandfather's fate unknown. Now he had the tool to change that. He personally supervised the meticulous process of documenting and removing the tape recorder from the chamber. Every step was critical. The 40-year-old tape was incredibly fragile, but it was also the single most important piece of evidence in modern American history. The chain of custody for this artifact would be unbreakable. The news of the discovery at the old Aerolux site spread like wildfire. The vanished 153, a case relegated to conspiracy websites and late-night paranormal shows, was suddenly front-page news again. But this time, the narrative was different. The discovery of the hidden chamber stripped away the layers of myth and folklore. It grounded the story in a new and terrifying reality, transforming it from an unsolved mystery into what it always was, an unprosecuted crime. With the evidence secured, Miles Corbin officially reopened the case. It was no longer a missing persons investigation. He reclassified it as a mass homicide, a bold and definitive statement that sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. The 153 employees of Aerolux Dynamics were now officially considered victims of a crime, and Miles was now hunting for a murderer who had enjoyed a 40-year head start. The families of the vanished, many of them now elderly, felt a painful resurgence of hope and dread. For decades they had been forced to live in a state of suspended grief, with no bodies to bury and no answers to give their children. The reopening of the case promised a chance at closure, but it also threatened to reveal a truth that might be more horrific than any of the fantastic theories they had been forced to endure. They watched and waited, their collective breath held. Back at the forensic lab, the tape recorder was treated with the reverence of a holy relic. Experts in audio restoration were brought in to assess the condition of the magnetic tape. They warned Miles that the process of extracting any sound from it would be painstakingly slow and delicate. The information on that tape was a ghost, and it would not give up its secrets easily. The risk of destroying it during the playback attempt was very real, adding another layer of tension to the investigation. Miles established a new incident room, the walls quickly covered with photographs of the 153 victims. His grandfather's smiling, confident face looked out from a 1960s-era photograph, a constant reminder of what was at stake. For the first time, there was a tangible path forward, a solid thread to pull in a case that had been nothing but loose ends. The entire investigation now hinged on what, if anything, was recorded on that tape. The initial forensic sweep of the control chamber yielded another crucial piece of information. Analysis of dust and air particles confirmed that the chamber had been sealed from the outside shortly after the night of the disappearance. Furthermore, microscopic analysis of the construction materials confirmed they were identical to those used in the main factory, proving it was built concurrently, not added later. This was part of Alistair Finch's original secret design. This discovery systematically dismantled the image of Alistair Finch as a tragic industrialist who lost his family in a bizarre event. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. The evidence placed him as the architect of the secret, the one person with the authority and resources to build a hidden chamber into his own factory. The question shifted from who could have done this to the far more chilling question of why a celebrated visionary would construct such a thing. The hope that had ignited with the chamber's discovery was now tempered by a growing sense of dread. The meticulous planning, the soundproofing, the lead lining, it all pointed toward an event of extreme violence, something that needed to be contained and concealed from the world both physically and sonically. The workers were not kidnapped or taken. They were processed. The factory was not just a workplace. It was an instrument. Miles Corbin knew he was standing at the precipice of a terrible truth. The narrative of a strange, bloodless disappearance had been a cold comfort for 40 years, allowing the world to file the event away as a curiosity. But the reality promised to be one of cold, calculated murder on an almost unimaginable scale. The benevolent patriarch Alistair Finch was being recast as a potential monster. The focus of the entire investigation narrowed to a single point: the fragile brown ribbon of magnetic tape sitting in a climate-controlled evidence locker. It was the black box of Aerolux Dynamics, the silent witness to the final moments of 153 people. Everything depended on its ability to speak after 40 years of enforced silence. The fate of the case and the legacy of all those who vanished rested on the faint magnetic signals embedded within. The team of audio engineers finally gave Miles the news he had been waiting for. The tape was stable enough for an initial playback attempt. It was a high-risk, high-reward moment. If it worked, it could solve the case. If it failed, the last and only witness would be gone forever, and the silence that had defined the mystery for 4 decades would become permanent. The weight of that moment was immense. Miles sat in the audio lab, watching through a thick pane of glass as a technician carefully threaded the old tape onto a modern machine. The entire room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. The mystery of the vanished 153 was about to be either solved or sealed forever. The journey that began with his grandfather's disappearance was culminating in this single, critical procedure, a technological seance with the past. The emotional landscape had shifted entirely. The melancholy of a cold case had been replaced by the high-stakes tension of an active homicide investigation. The ghost story had become a hunt for a ghost maker. The question was no longer what happened to the 153 workers of Aerolux Dynamics, but rather what had been done to them by the man they trusted with their lives and their futures. As the technician's finger hovered over the play button, Miles understood that whatever came next would change everything. The truth was finally within reach, but it was a truth that had been deliberately buried for a reason. The discovery of the chamber and the tape recorder was merely the act of unearthing a tomb. But this discovery was only the first piece of a macabre puzzle that nobody was prepared to assemble. The investigation began not with a bang, but with the hushed, sterile hum of an audio restoration laboratory. The Ampex tape recorder, a gleaming relic from another era, sat on a sterile workbench, its reels of fragile tape representing the single most important witness in a 40-year-old mass murder. Detective Miles Corbin watched through reinforced glass as technicians in white lab coats moved with the painstaking precision of surgeons. They explained the immense challenge. The magnetic oxide coating on the Mylar tape was brittle, prone to shedding at the slightest provocation. Playing it was a one-shot opportunity. One mistake could erase the only existing account of the final moments of 153 people, including his own grandfather. The process was agonizingly slow, a battle against time and decay. The technicians first proposed a technique known as baking, a controlled heating process designed to temporarily restore the tape's integrity by re-adhering the binder to the plastic base. It was a high-risk procedure that could just as easily render the tape unplayable forever. Miles gave the authorization, his signature on the form feeling heavier than any he had ever signed. For days, the tape was subjected to a low, constant temperature in a specialized oven, a delicate resuscitation of a voice that had been silent for 4 decades. Every hour that passed felt like a year stolen from the victims. While the forensic audio team performed their delicate work, Miles launched a parallel assault on the past. He established a new war room, its walls papered not only with the faces of the victims, but with every document related to Alistair Finch and Aerolux Dynamics. The initial 1962 investigation had focused on external threats and impossible scenarios. Miles's investigation had a single, unwavering focus: the man who had built the factory. He began by re-examining Finch's official statement from the original case file, a document filled with eloquent expressions of grief and disbelief, portraying a patriarch devastated by the loss of his family. But how could that be reconciled with the existence of a secret, soundproofed control chamber built into the factory's very foundation? The first cracks in Finch's carefully constructed facade appeared in the corporate archives. Miles, armed with modern data analysis software, began cross-referencing financial records, supply chain manifests, and construction invoices from the late 1950s when the factory was built. He discovered a series of heavily redacted and deeply buried expenditures, all funneling into a shell corporation with no listed purpose. These funds, totaling millions of dollars, corresponded to purchases of specialized materials not listed on the public blueprints. Tons of lead sheeting, advanced acoustic dampening foam, and custom-built high-amperage electrical conduits. These were the very materials used to construct the hidden chamber. This discovery was the first piece of hard evidence linking Finch directly to the premeditated construction of the secret room. It proved that the chamber was not an afterthought or a hidden renovation, but an integral part of the factory's original design, deliberately concealed from official records and government inspectors. The benevolent industrialist was, at the very least, a methodical liar. The question was no longer if he was involved, but to what end. What purpose could such a chamber possibly serve in a facility designed for building aircraft? The answer, Miles suspected, lay in the project the night shift was working on when they vanished. Official records from 1962 were frustratingly vague, citing only a classified government contract under a generic project number. However, with the passage of 40 years, many of those documents had been declassified. Miles filed an expedited request under the Freedom of Information Act, leveraging the new status of the case as a mass homicide investigation. Weeks later, a box of heavily censored documents arrived from the Department of Defense archives. Most of the text was blacked out, but one phrase had been missed by the censor's pen: Project Echo, Phase 3, Live Asset Integration. The term live asset was a cold military euphemism, and its implications were horrifying. To understand Project Echo, Miles brought in a retired physicist who had consulted for the government during the Cold War. The elderly man, his eyes sharp despite his age, reviewed the declassified schematics and financial records. He recognized the patterns immediately: the massive power conduits, the specialized resonant cavities described in engineering notes, and the acoustic dampening were not for building planes. They were the components of a theoretical weapon system from that era, a large-scale resonant frequency generator. In theory, such a device could produce a sonic wave so powerful it could bypass conventional materials and target organic matter specifically. The physicist explained the chilling concept in stark terms. The weapon would emit a precise, high-intensity frequency designed to resonate with the molecular structure of water and carbon, the building blocks of the human body. The effect would be catastrophic and instantaneous, causing cellular disintegration at a molecular level. It would be a weapon that left buildings, machinery, and all inorganic materials perfectly untouched, but would effectively liquefy any living organism within its field. It was a silent, invisible killer, the perfect weapon for an era obsessed with plausible deniability. The factory, he concluded, was not a factory at all. It was the weapon. This revelation recast the entire event in a new, monstrous light. The pristine condition of the factory, which had baffled investigators for 40 years, was not a clue to a mysterious disappearance. It was the direct and intended result of the weapon's activation. The half-full coffee cup, the dropped wrench. These were not signs of a workforce that had simply vanished. They were the last traces of people who had been annihilated in an instant, their physical forms disintegrated where they stood. The lack of bodies was not the mystery. It was the weapon's signature. Miles now had a motive, a means, and a perpetrator. Alistair Finch, under the cover of a patriotic aerospace contract, had used his own factory and his loyal workforce to conduct the final horrific field test of a sonic weapon. He had built an observation chamber to watch his experiment unfold, to monitor the results from a protected, lead-lined vantage point. The 153 men and women of the night shift were not his employees. They were his live assets, disposable variables in a monstrous equation of power and destruction. His public grief was a performance, a masterful piece of theater to conceal an act of mass murder. The investigation then turned to the human element. Who else knew? A conspiracy of this magnitude would require accomplices. Miles's team began digging into the backgrounds of Finch's inner circle from that era, his board of directors, his chief of security, and the government liaisons assigned to the project. Most were deceased, their secrets buried with them. However, they managed to track down a former junior executive from Aerolux, now an old man living in a retirement community in Arizona. He was one of the few surviving members of Finch's executive team. The man, initially hesitant, eventually agreed to speak. He remembered Alistair Finch not as a warm patriarch, but as a cold, intensely private genius obsessed with what he called acoustic architecture. He recalled that Finch had a private laboratory deep within the complex that no one was ever allowed to enter. He also remembered the night of the disappearance vividly. He was a young executive then and had been ordered by Finch to remain at an off-site command post miles away, told it was a critical communications drill. He and a few others were instructed to ignore any unusual energy readings from the main plant. At the time, it seemed like a strange but unimportant order. Now it was clear he had been positioned as an unwitting accessory to a massacre. His testimony provided crucial corroboration. It confirmed Finch's secretive nature and his direct, hands-on management of the events of that night. It painted a picture of a man who had systematically isolated his victims, positioned his potential witnesses far from the scene, and prepared a cover story in advance. The disappearance was not an experiment gone wrong. It was the experiment's successful conclusion. Finch had planned every single detail, from the construction of the weapon to the management of the fallout. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. Back in the audio lab, the technicians finally had a breakthrough. After weeks of delicate work, they had successfully digitized the first few minutes of the tape. The quality was remarkably clear, preserved by the hermetically sealed environment of the chamber. The lead audio engineer called Miles into the soundproofed listening room, his face grim. He warned Miles that what he was about to hear was disturbing. He pressed play, and the sound of 40 years of silence was finally broken. The recording began with the low ambient hum of machinery, the background noise of the factory floor filtering faintly into the sealed chamber. Then a voice cut through the hum, a voice Miles recognized instantly from old newsreels of Alistair Finch. It was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion. October 12, 1962, 2200 hours, Finch's voice stated, as if dictating a lab note. Project Echo Phase 3 test sequence initiated. All external security protocols confirmed. Containment field is stable. The clinical detachment in his voice was chilling. He was not a man in distress. He was a scientist observing his work. The recording continued with Finch making notations about power levels and ambient temperature. There was a faint click, followed by a new sound, a low-frequency hum that began to build steadily in intensity. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the listener, even through the speakers. Miles felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He was listening to the activation sequence of the weapon. This initial segment of the tape was a bombshell. It placed Alistair Finch at the scene, inside the hidden chamber, personally initiating the event that led to the death of 153 people. It was a direct contradiction of his official alibi, in which he claimed to have been at home, 60 miles away, at the time of the disappearance. His public persona, his carefully crafted alibi, and his legacy as a tragic figure were all shattered by the sound of his own voice, captured and preserved for 40 years. The investigation now had its smoking gun, but the work was far from over. The tape confirmed Finch's guilt, but the scope of the conspiracy remained a question. How high up in the government did the knowledge of Project Echo go? Who signed off on a weapons test that used American citizens as guinea pigs? The disappearance of the 153 was not just the crime of one sociopathic genius. It was potentially a dark secret kept by the state itself, a crime for which no one had ever been held accountable. Miles ordered his team to re-examine the declassified documents, this time looking not for what was there, but for what was missing. They began to notice patterns in the redactions, signs of a coordinated effort to scrub the names of specific government officials and military departments from the record. The cover-up had been as meticulous as the crime itself, a bureaucratic wall of silence built to protect those in power. Finch may have pulled the trigger, but he was not acting alone. The team cross-referenced the few unredacted names with flight manifests and travel logs from the period. They discovered that a high-ranking Department of Defense official and 2 military scientists had flown into a private airfield near Finchville under assumed names 2 days before the disappearance. They had left the morning after. They were not just liaisons. They were observers, partners in Finch's horrific experiment. The conspiracy was real, and it reached into the highest echelons of the military-industrial complex. The weight of this new knowledge was immense. Miles was no longer just solving his grandfather's murder. He was uncovering a foundational crime of the Cold War, a secret so dark it had been successfully buried for nearly half a century. The official narrative of a freak, unsolvable mystery was the most successful part of the entire operation. It had allowed the guilty to die of old age, celebrated as patriots and pioneers, their crimes washed clean by time and secrecy. The forensic team, using advanced digital filters, managed to enhance a section of the audio where the factory noise was loudest, just before the main frequency wave was activated. They isolated faint, panicked shouts from the factory floor, the sounds of men and women realizing something was terribly wrong. It was a brief, chaotic moment of human terror, a stark contrast to Finch's cold narration. For Miles, this was the most important discovery. It gave the victims their voices back, even if only for a few fleeting, horrifying seconds. This piece of audio personalized the tragedy in a way that documents and schematics never could. It transformed the vanished 153 from a statistic back into what they were: people, mechanics, engineers, secretaries, and custodians who had trusted their employer completely. They were people like his grandfather, Elias Corbin, who had believed he was building the future, never suspecting he was merely an expendable component in a weapon designed to erase it. The emotional toll on Miles was profound, but it hardened his resolve. He began preparing his final report, a document that would not only solve a 40-year-old cold case, but would also rewrite a chapter of American history. He compiled the evidence methodically: the blueprints of the hidden chamber, the financial records of the Shell Corporation, the physicist's testimony on sonic weaponry, the statement from the retired executive, and the damning audio from the first portion of the tape. The case against Alistair Finch and his unnamed government partners was airtight and irrefutable. The new investigation had systematically deconstructed the myth and replaced it with a brutal, verifiable truth. Every piece of new evidence refuted the official story and exposed the lies that had protected the guilty for so long. The paranoia that had surrounded the case for decades was not unfounded. It was simply misdirected. The threat had not come from the sky or from a foreign power. It had come from within, from a celebrated leader who saw human life as nothing more than a resource to be consumed. The focus of the investigation had shifted from what happened to who will be held accountable. With Finch and many of his collaborators dead, legal justice was a complex issue, but Miles was determined to achieve historical justice. He would expose the truth, no matter how high it reached or whose legacy it destroyed. The 153 victims deserved, at the very least, to have their story told accurately, their murders acknowledged, and their names cleared from the realm of myth and conspiracy. Miles sat alone in his office late one night, the faces of the victims staring back at him from the wall. He thought of the generations of families, including his own, who had lived in a state of limbo, haunted by a question that had been deliberately designed to be unanswerable. He now had the answer. The truth was not complex or supernatural. It was simple, brutal, and born of human ambition. It was a truth that had been waiting patiently in a sealed room, spooled onto a magnetic tape. The quiet of the office was broken by the ringing of his phone. It was the head of the audio lab. His voice was tense. "Miles," he said, "you need to get down here right now. We've done it. We've managed to restore the entire recording right to the end." The engineer paused, his breath audible over the line. "We now know exactly what happened in those final moments, and you are not prepared for what Alistair Finch says after the silence falls." The investigation had uncovered the how and the why. It had identified the killer and the weapon. But the tape held something more. It held the final, chilling testament of the architect himself, his personal thoughts in the immediate aftermath of committing one of the most monstrous acts in history. What final, damning words had Alistair Finch recorded for posterity? The answer was waiting for him in the lab, the final piece of a puzzle that would bring the 40-year-old mystery to its devastating conclusion. Miles stood up, his heart pounding. The journey that had started with a demolition crew breaking through a concrete floor was about to end in a soundproofed room, with the voice of a dead man providing the final, irrefutable confession. He walked toward the lab knowing that the truth he was about to hear would not only solve the case, but would also become a permanent scar on the nation's conscience. The silence was about to be broken permanently. The investigation had meticulously rebuilt the timeline of a crime, stripping away decades of myth and speculation to reveal a core of calculated evil. It had exposed the respectable facade of a celebrated industrialist to reveal the sociopath beneath. The cracks had become a chasm, swallowing the entire official narrative. The methodical buildup of evidence had created an unassailable case against a ghost, proving that some secrets cannot remain buried forever. The team had followed the evidence from a hidden chamber to redacted government files, from the laws of physics to the faint magnetic echoes on a fragile piece of tape. Each step had taken them further from the realm of mystery and deeper into a conspiracy of silence and murder. The frustration of the past 40 years had been replaced by the cold, hard certainty of the truth. The only question that remained was what the full, unedited recording would reveal about the mind of the man responsible. Miles Corbin had entered this investigation seeking answers for his family. He now carried the weight of 153 families on his shoulders. The truth he was about to confront was not just the solution to a crime, but the final eulogy for all those who had been erased on that October night. He pushed open the door to the audio lab, ready to hear the final words that would condemn a celebrated pioneer and, finally, bring a measure of justice to the vanished. The narrative had been completely rewritten. The story was no longer about a mysterious event that defied explanation. It was now the story of a horrific, state-sanctioned weapons test, and the man who had the audacity to record it for his own records. The suspense was no longer about the unknown, but about the full, horrifying scope of the known. The final act of the tragedy was about to be played out, 40 years after it was recorded. But the truth, as Miles was about to learn, was far more complex and personal than even he could have imagined. The tape held one last secret, a final shocking revelation that would reframe the entire motive behind Alistair Finch's monstrous act. What they were about to hear would not only solve the crime, but would also expose the deeply personal obsession that fueled it. Miles Corbin entered the audio laboratory, the sterile silence of the room a stark contrast to the storm of anticipation within him. The lead audio engineer, a man named Harris, met him with a look of profound gravity, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He gestured toward the soundproofed listening booth where a single chair was positioned before a set of high-fidelity speakers. The Ampex tape, now digitized and preserved, was the ghost in this machine. Harris spoke in a low, hushed tone, his voice barely a whisper. "We got everything, Detective. The entire recording is stable from start to finish. It's clearer than we ever thought possible. What you're about to hear, it doesn't just solve the case, it gives it a voice." Miles took his seat in the booth, the heavy door sealing him inside with 40 years of buried history. Through the glass, he could see Harris at the control console, his hand hovering over the playback command. This was the culmination of his life's work, the answer to a question that had defined his family's sorrow. He was about to become the first person to witness the final moments of his grandfather, Elias Corbin, and 152 other souls. He gave a single, sharp nod. Harris met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the moment's wait, and pressed the button. The speakers hissed to life, and the ghost of 1962 began to speak from its magnetic tomb. The recording began with the familiar clinical voice of Alistair Finch, exactly as Miles had heard in the initial sample. October 12, 1962. 2200 hours. Project Echo. Phase 3. Test sequence initiated. The voice was a chilling metronome, counting down to a tragedy. Finch's narration was interspersed with the low ambient hum of the factory, a faint but constant reminder of the 153 people working just beyond his hidden chamber, oblivious to their fate. He was a scientist dictating notes, his tone devoid of any humanity as he confirmed power levels and containment field integrity. The banality of his words made the impending horror even more grotesque. Then a new sound emerged, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the listening booth. It was the weapon activating a low-frequency thrum that grew steadily in pitch and intensity. Miles felt his muscles tense, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He could hear, faintly, at first, a change in the factory's ambient noise. The steady rhythm of work was replaced by confused shouts, the distant clang of a dropped tool, and a rising murmur of alarm. The workers were beginning to realize something was wrong. Their dawning terror was a faint, chaotic counterpoint to Finch's cold, controlled narration from his soundproofed box. The hum escalated into a piercing, high-frequency whine, a sound that felt physically painful even through the speakers. The muffled shouts from the factory floor were cut short, replaced by a brief, chaotic cacophony of sound that was almost indescribable. A tearing, violent noise that lasted no more than 3 seconds. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The high-frequency wave ceased, and what followed was a silence so profound, so absolute, that it was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was the sound of 153 lives being simultaneously extinguished, the sound of a factory floor suddenly devoid of all life. Into this crushing silence, Alistair Finch's voice returned as calm and steady as before. He paused for a moment, as if listening to the nothingness he had just created. "Test successful," he stated, his voice a clean, sharp incision into the quiet. "Containment effective. All assets liquidated." The phrase hung in the air, a monstrous epitaph delivered by the murderer himself. This was the irrefutable proof, the confession that damned him for all time. Miles closed his eyes, the words burning into his mind. He had found the truth, and it was as cold and brutal as he had feared. But the recording was not over. After another long, deliberate pause, Finch's voice returned, but the tone had shifted. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by something far more personal, something venomous and laced with a chilling intimacy. "A final note, for the record," Finch said, his voice now directed not at a logbook, but as if speaking to a single person. "This outcome was necessitated by the sentimentality of lesser men. Elias, my friend, you should have stayed in your lane. Your moral objections and your threat to expose this project to the Oversight Committee forced my hand. You believed you were building the future, but you were never able to see the cost of true progress." Miles felt the air leave his lungs. This was the final devastating secret. The test had not just been a scheduled experiment, it had been an execution, accelerated and triggered by his grandfather's conscience. Elias Corbin was not just a random victim, he was the specific target, the catalyst for the massacre. He had discovered the true nature of Project Echo, and, in his attempt to stop it, had sealed his own fate and the fate of everyone on his shift. Alistair Finch had not just killed his workforce, he had murdered a friend to protect his monstrous secret, using the weapons test as the perfect, untraceable method. The voice on the tape continued, dripping with a sociopath's self-justification. "You saw these people as a family, Elias. I saw them as variables. Your loyalty was to them, mine is to the history books. Progress requires sacrifice, and tonight you and your entire shift have become a necessary, albeit premature sacrifice for a new era of American power. You chose to be a hero, and I chose to be a god. Let's see which legacy endures." The recording ended with the sharp, definitive click of the stop button, followed by the faint sound of Finch rising from his chair. And then there was only the hiss of empty tape. The silence that filled the listening booth now was different. It was no longer the silence of the unknown, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a truth fully revealed. Miles sat frozen, the final words of his grandfather's murderer echoing in his mind. The crime was no longer just a cold, calculated act of military ambition. It was a deeply personal betrayal, a story of friendship and loyalty twisted into a motive for mass murder. He finally understood the full scope of the evil he had been hunting. Alistair Finch was not just a monster. He was a man who had wrapped his monstrosity in the flag of progress and patriotism. He emerged from the booth, his face a mask of grim resolve. Harris and the other technicians looked at him, their expressions a mixture of awe and horror. No words were needed. They had all heard it. They were all witnesses, 40 years removed, to a crime that defied comprehension. Miles walked over to the console and simply said, "Certify it. Make a dozen copies. I'm holding a press conference in the morning." The hunt was over. The time for justice, in the court of public opinion and in the pages of history, had finally arrived. The next day, the world listened. News outlets broadcast excerpts of the tape, Alistair Finch's calm, murderous voice filling the airwaves. The story of the vanished 153 was rewritten in an instant, the myths and conspiracies vaporized by the horrifying reality. The narrative of an unexplained phenomenon was replaced by the documented account of a state-sanctioned weapons test and a corporate massacre. The celebrated legacy of Alistair Finch, the philanthropic industrialist, was systematically dismantled and utterly destroyed. His name became synonymous not with innovation, but with calculated inhuman evil. The declassified documents, now contextualized by the tape, were released in full. The names of the government officials who had observed the test were exposed, leading to a massive posthumous scandal that rocked the foundations of the Department of Defense. While the principal conspirators were long dead and beyond the reach of earthly justice, their reputations were ruined, their legacies forever tarnished. The Finch Foundation and its associated corporations collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and public outrage. Their assets seized to create a compensation fund for the victims' families. It was not courtroom justice, but it was a reckoning. For the surviving families, the revelation was a torrent of conflicting emotions. There was the agony of learning the brutal truth of their loved ones' final moments, a pain sharper than 4 decades of uncertainty. But there was also a profound, cathartic release. The weight of the unknown was finally lifted. Their parents, grandparents, and siblings were no longer characters in a ghost story. They were heroes. Elias Corbin, in particular, was posthumously honored for his attempt to stop the atrocity, his act of defiance finally brought to light. The families could finally mourn, their grief now anchored to a known truth. Miles Corbin personally met with many of the families, sharing the details of the investigation and answering their questions. He saw the relief in the eyes of elderly men and women who had waited their entire adult lives for this day. He watched as grandchildren learned the true story of the grandparents they had never met. His own family found a painful but necessary closure. The shadow that had loomed over them for 2 generations began to recede, replaced by a sense of pride in Elias Corbin's final courageous act. The open wound in their family history could finally begin to heal. A memorial was commissioned to be built on the now cleared site of the Aerolux factory. The design was simple, a stark black granite wall polished to a mirror finish. Etched into the stone were the names of all 153 victims, a permanent testament to the lives that were erased on that October night. At the base of the wall, a single powerful inscription was carved. The truth endures. It was a promise that their story, once buried under concrete and lies, would now be told forever. A warning for generations to come. Miles stood at the site weeks later, watching the foundation for the memorial being poured. The desert wind blew across the empty landscape, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer a haunting, empty silence, but a peaceful one. The ghosts of Finchville had finally been laid to rest. He had started this journey seeking answers for his grandfather, but he had found something more, a restoration of historical truth and a measure of justice for all the victims. His work was done, the long echo of that terrible night finally fading. The case of the vanished 153 served as a stark and enduring reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those from folklore, but those who walk among us, cloaked in respectability and power. It demonstrated that conspiracies, no matter how meticulously planned or well protected, can be unraveled by a single, determined voice seeking the truth. Alistair Finch had sought to write his own legacy, but in the end he had only succeeded in recording his own damnation, preserving it for a future he could not control. The story was no longer about how 153 people vanished into thin air. It was about how they were murdered and how their memory was finally reclaimed from the realm of myth. The final truth was a testament to the idea that no secret is truly safe, that no crime is so perfect it can outlast the slow, relentless passage of time. The magnetic tape, a fragile ribbon of plastic and rust, had proven to be more durable than concrete, more powerful than a corporation, and more enduring than the lies of powerful men. Justice, Miles reflected, does not always come in the form of a verdict or a prison sentence. Sometimes it arrives as a revelation, a cleansing fire of truth that burns away decades of deception and restores the dignity of the dead. For the 153 souls of Aerolux Dynamics, justice was the sound of their story being told, their names being honored, and their sacrifice finally being understood by a world that had, for too long, mistaken a massacre for a mystery. The final chilling words on the tape had provided not only a confession, but a motive rooted in arrogance and betrayal. Elias Corbin's quiet heroism, his refusal to be a silent accomplice, had cost him everything, but it had also, in a way, planted the seed of the truth's eventual discovery. Finch had recorded his justifications out of pure hubris, believing his secret was sealed forever. He never imagined that the very record he created to immortalize his god-like decision would become the instrument of his eternal infamy. In the end, the new investigation did more than just close a cold case. It corrected the historical record, holding a mirror up to a nation's past and exposing the dark potential of unchecked power and secrecy. The truth, once unearthed, had a momentum all its own, tearing through the carefully constructed narratives and leaving only the stark, unvarnished facts in its wake. The families could now point to the memorial and tell the real story, a story of courage and tragedy, not of paranormal events or alien abductions. Miles Corbin had solved the greatest mystery of his time, but the victory was bittersweet. He had exposed a horrific crime and honored his grandfather's memory, but the cost had been the innocence of an entire community and the lives of 153 people. The resolution was not a happy ending, but a necessary one. It affirmed a fundamental principle, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried or how long it takes, will eventually find its way to the light. It is a promise that gives meaning to the search, and a hope that sustains those left behind in the dark. The press conference was a global event, a moment of collective shock and reckoning. Miles presented the evidence with methodical clarity, letting the facts and the chilling audio speak for themselves. He did not present himself as a hero, but as a servant of the evidence. He was simply the man who had been in the right place at the right time to listen to a voice that had been crying out from the past for 40 years. His role was to amplify that voice so that the entire world could hear its terrible message. The legacy of Finchville was transformed. It was no longer a symbol of an unsolved puzzle, but a landmark of a solved crime, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the absolute corruption that can fester in secret. The empty lots and crumbling foundations were no longer just sad remnants of a ghost town. They were now part of a crime scene, the hallowed ground where 153 Americans were sacrificed on the altar of ambition. The story had found its definitive, heartbreaking end. For Miles, the resolution brought a quiet peace. He had fulfilled the unspoken promise he had made to his family and to himself. He had stared into the abyss of his grandfather's disappearance and had not only found the truth, but had dragged it, kicking and screaming, into the light for all to see. The weight he had carried his entire life was finally lifted, replaced by the somber satisfaction of a duty performed and a promise kept across generations. The final act of the tragedy was not the disappearance itself, but the long, agonizing silence that followed. The revelation was the breaking of that silence, a thunderclap of truth that echoed across 4 decades. The emotional closure came from this act of speaking, of naming the victims, identifying the killer, and telling their story. The narrative was finally complete, the last chapter written not in speculation, but in the indelible ink of fact. The true antagonist was never a mystery, but silence itself, a silence meticulously engineered and ruthlessly enforced. The victory was not over Alistair Finch, who was long dead, but over the silence he had created. Every news report, every newspaper headline, every conversation about the truth of Arrow Lux was a blow against that silence. The voices of the victims, channeled through a 40-year-old tape and a determined detective, were ultimately louder than the weapon that had killed them. The memorial wall stood as a final silent witness. The names, etched in stone, were a testament to individual lives, reclaiming them from the anonymous statistic of the 153. Families could now come and touch a name, connecting with their lost loved ones in a place of honor rather than a place of mystery. The emotional resolution was found in this simple act of remembrance, an act made possible only by the unearthing of the terrible, necessary truth. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, casting long shadows from the new memorial, the story of Arrow Lux Dynamics found its final resting place. It was no longer a question mark in the annals of the unexplained, but a period, definitive and absolute. The truth had not brought the dead back to life, but it had restored their humanity and honored their memory, proving that even after decades of darkness, the persistent search for light is a cause that is never truly lost.